Diablo 2, one of the most iconic games of the modern era, has been something I've enjoyed countless times since I first watched my dad running through the Act 1 catacombs. Even though I love it so much, it wasn't until Diablo 2 Resurrected came out that I even played on anything above base difficulty. I would clear the game and just roll a new character. But another aspect of the game I never engaged with was hardcore mode. The idea of permadeath didn't really appeal to me, since if you're just a casual player, it's ridiculously easy to make the wrong decision and die. Or get caught in a crowd against an enemy with powerful modifiers and die. Or fall into a rhythm so deep that your brain goes on autopilot and you stop paying attention to your health until it's too late, and you die. All these dumb ways to die aside, it left me curious if with the knowledge I have now, could I beat hardcore mode? Of course I could. It would be a cakewalk. But while this was rattling around in my head, I came across the Backlogs video where Lemon did a Thorns-Only challenge run and it looked fun, so I figured I'd pose the question, can you beat Diablo 2 Resurrected on hardcore with Thorns-Only? Yes, but no. However, before I explain, a huge shout out to these wonderful people for their continued support on Patreon. You guys are great and I genuinely appreciate you. Second, you'll notice that for the first act of the game I'm streaming, but for the remainder I'm not. And that's because I just can't find the time right now to do so, especially since I just moved and hadn't had much time for my hobbies. But do keep an eye on my Twitch channel so that when I do go live and do more challenges, you guys can hang out. Lastly, do me a favor and leave a like, comment, or both. They help more than you think when it comes to the YouTube algorithm, especially for small channels. Anyway, back to it. Okay, let me explain what I meant about only sorta being able to beat Diablo 2 because this will inform our rule set. So the way Thorns works in Diablo 2 is that when an enemy strikes you, depending on your build, they'll either take flat damage in Retaliation or percentage-based damage in Retaliation. However, this only applies to melee damage, so projectiles like arrows and exploding potions don't trigger the effect. Even worse, it only applies to physical damage, so magic will literally never trigger Thorns. Where this matters is at the very end of Act 4 when you go to face Diablo. Before the fight, you have to break several seals, but you'll be attacked by a variety of enemies led by a mini-boss of sorts. You have to kill these mini-bosses in order to trigger the Diablo fight itself, but among those bosses is an enemy that deals exclusively magic damage, essentially killing the run. Even more so when you remember that there's an entire 5th act after beating Diablo. So, what am I going to be doing differently to make this run viable? Well, there's a few things, so here are the rules. I am in no way allowed to actively cause damage to anything with a health bar. I can only rely on damage from sources outside of my control or that enemies cause to themselves. To give myself more wiggle room since this is hardcore, I'm allowing myself to hire a mercenary, but I can only choose one, and regardless of if I need other skills, I am stuck with that follower. The limitation of this, of course, is that it costs money to resurrect them if they die, so economy is going to be important. My main sources of damage can only come from thorns or magic items that add a chance for a skill to trigger in response to taking damage. I'll also be playing in offline mode, which I'll explain when we get into the run. Other than that, it's a standard Diablo 2 run. So right out the gate, to make this run both possible and not a total nightmare, we'll be choosing the Paladin as our class specifically for the Thorns aura, which is going to carry us through the challenge. To start, we need to find something that allows us to do Thorns damage before we can use the proper Thorns skill, because for that, we need experience. And to get experience, we need a way to kill enemies. So I spend some time running around the first zone looking for either a chipped skull that I could slot into a shield, or a piece of gear that offers flat thorns damage. As I said earlier, we're playing in offline mode and there's a very specific reason for this. In offline mode, the map you generate is the map you have forever, so in the event I need to farm a section like the Countess for example, I will always know the exact route to take every single time. In online mode, every time you reload the game, the map is generated again, giving you something different every single time, which just isn't ideal when you're trying to be efficient. I end up having to quit out to reload the map, reset the treasure chest and the vendors in hopes of finding something to get us going. Finally, after almost 40 minutes, we finally get the blacksmith Charcy to sell us a sash and quilted armor of thorns, both of which cause the attacker to take 1 damage when striking us. 2 thorns damage ain't much, but it's a start. With the way forward open, we head out into the world to finally start our adventure. We get lucky with an experience shrine right before going into our first quest location, the Den of Evil. Something I learned early on is that if you're unsure if an enemy has a physical melee attack, just run up to them. You'd be surprised how many creatures have alternate attacks. Thankfully, the fallen shaman didn't get the memo and just keeps hitting himself. The one thing that's hard to convey about this kind of run is just how long it takes. Since we aren't actively attacking anyone, all we can do is run up to their faces and wait for the trash to take itself out. You might have noticed I'm playing with a controller, and that's almost exclusively for the ease of potion access and to a lesser degree the mobility. If I'm in a pickle, I don't want to be thinking about where my cursor is on screen. Not to mention I have a very sensitive mouse, so it was also a secondary precaution to prevent myself from hitting anything. It's also why I switched my main action to throwables. Anywho, after another 10 minutes, I finally cleared the Den of Evil. For now, I've been putting skill points into prayer since we don't have access to thorns yet. I decided not to use auras because then I'd be splitting my skill points across even more skills. Not to mention, since this idea was born of a Thorns-Only challenge, I wanted to stick to the spirit of that challenge. After the Den of Evil, we skipped the Bloodraven side quest for 2 reasons. First, we can't even kill Bloodraven because she exclusively uses a bow. Second, since I'm limited to just 1 mercenary, I don't want to waste that slot on an Act 1 archer. So instead, we decided to head straight for the Tristram questline. While I'm going through the underground passage, I actually end up getting extremely unlucky with my placement and get surrounded by a ton of enemies that were kicking my ass. I had to utilize the save quit or we were 100% going to die. This is the only time I end up doing this during combat, so don't worry, this didn't become a habit. We did level up during that scare though, so once I get back in, I finally put my first of many points into Thorns, and now we're cooking with gas. With our stat points, I spend most of my points here in the early game pumping up my vitality to give us more life and stamina. Since we'll be face-taking most enemies, we need survivability. As the game progresses, we'll also dump points into strength to allow us to wield items with higher defense ratings. The second pass through the underground passage is far easier, especially with an active Thorns aura. The trouble we're running into early game is that things just aren't dying fast enough, which means we go through our stock of potions relatively quickly. We definitely can't afford to buy a ton, so we mostly rely on potion drops to keep us going. We locate the Tree of Innovis to get the scroll we need to get back to Akara to have translated. Then we go locate the Cairn Stones that we'd found much earlier to touch them in the right order after dealing with Rakanishu. Tristram was much more forgiving than I thought it would be. We rescue Deckard Cain before doing anything else, and to be honest, we don't really need to continue being here, but I figured we might as well collect some experience and try to net ourselves some solid items. Unfortunately, nothing of interest comes our way, so we make it back to the rogue encampment. Now that we've rescued Deckard, he'll identify items for us for free. Interestingly, you don't have to rescue him, but if you don't, when he finally does show up later, he'll charge you a fee to identify items. And I'm already poor, so the last thing I need is Deckard coming to me to cash his social security checks. I do come across the Countess's tower, but there were enough archers inside to make me question the viability of going further inside, so I end up skipping this entirely until I need to come back later for runes. From here I make a beeline towards Andariel. Act 1 is always the quickest to get through, especially when you've done it a bazillion times as a kid. I do pick up Charcy's Heraldric Malice from the barracks, but the skeleton mages had me pretty nervous. They tend to come in clusters, and with my elemental resistances being so low, they were chipping off HP left and right. I know it's best practice to hold off on Charcy's enchantment until later in the game, but I did roll the dice since I wasn't sure if I'd even survive long enough to regret the decision. The shield we got was actually super good for what we were doing, but I just completely blanked because I was busy talking and just completely forgot to equip it. Even worse, I ended up selling it accidentally. Once I finally make it to the Catacombs level 4, I do what I always do to prepare. I open a portal in the entrance room just in case I need to skedaddle, then I clear out the first large room since this is where I usually fight Andariel. It took an annoying amount of time to clear the enemies in here because of the shamans. There were quite a few, so I was taking fire from all over the place while also dealing with the enemies in my face. A creature I didn't mention earlier that was absolutely at the top of my frustration leaderboard is the Afflicted. These assholes have a ranged and melee attack, but they very clearly favor the ranged attack. Getting up close doesn't necessarily guarantee they'll melee you. In fact, they're much more likely to put distance between you to use their ranged attack and just keep chipping away. Finally, we clear the dance floor and invite Andariel for a tango. Andariel, under normal circumstances, isn't anything crazy. Her attacks inflict poison, which is whatever when you're doing a casual run, but when you're playing hardcore and you can't actively attack, it makes dealing with her poison and her heavy hits much more troublesome. On several occasions, we have no real choice but to retreat from the battle just to clear our poison and restock our potions. This back and forth happens a handful of times before we finally cause her to punch herself so hard that she spontaneously combusts. We pick up the stuff she leaves behind, say nothing to anyone, and head east into the desert for Act 2. Once we make it into Act 2, the first thing we do after scoping out the local vendors is hire our preferred mercenary, who we're committing to for the rest of the run. Having the mercenary not only gives us passive attack power, but also solves the Act 4 issue in a more direct way. Again, the trade-off is that the stronger he gets, the more expensive it becomes to resurrect him, and he's going to die quite a bit over the course of his employment with us. But like any good boss, I'll just throw him a pizza party afterward and we'll be square. We end up hiring Azrael for the Defiance ability, which buffs our defense by a significant amount, adding to our overall ability to keep our insides inside of us. Since I'm not required to take on the introductory quest in the sewers of Lut Gholein, I instead opt to just head out into the desert to get this party started. Of all the creatures in Act 2, there are interestingly enough only 2 that I was genuinely concerned about. The first are these beetles that release charged bolts every time they take damage. This includes damage taken from thorns. My resistances aren't that great, so if we get surrounded and wailed on, we could inadvertently get ourselves killed from the retaliation to our retaliation. The second creature I'm concerned about is the Act 2 boss, Duriel. I always have issues with Duriel, and for many casuals, this demon is the first genuine roadblock, but we'll cross that bridge when we get to it. Having done this a bazillion times, I head straight for the Dry Hills to collect the first of 3 quest items, the Herodic Cube. The run through the Halls of the Dead to get the cube went about as I expected. It was informative of what kinds of creatures would give me issues here in Act 2, while also reminding me on several occasions that the poison will certainly get me into trouble if I'm not paying attention. It isn't terribly long before I find the room where the cube is stashed, but it's full of ranged enemies that were putting more holes in me than a piercing fetishist. So I had to back off and let our merc handle the riffraff. After that was cleared out, we grab the cube and head to the far oasis where the next quest item is waiting in the maggot lair. After a trek deeper into the desert, we finally make it to the dungeon with less wiggle room than a defendant on trial for murder. The halls are so narrow that we have to hope we don't run into any of the ranged bugs while our merc follows along behind us. It also isn't ideal for going toe to toe with the beetles since there isn't really anywhere to run to avoid the charged bolts. There's nothing terribly interesting about this place in terms of dynamic or visuals, so let's skip forward to the end of the dungeon where we find your mom watching reruns of Law & Order. We kick over her live laugh love sign and leave with her favorite heraldic shaft. All that's left is to collect an item from the Claw Viper Temple. You might also notice that the sun has disappeared. This is because a hot goth girl put a hex on me after letting her believe I'm a Capricorn when I'm actually a Taurus. One thing I haven't touched on is just how funny it is to just be taking a stroll through an area and having the enemies around me kill over. Skeletons are definitely the funniest since they just fall apart with a rattle that tickles me every time. There are only 2 floors to the Claw Viper Temple, one of which is just the room holding the amulet we need, so getting through here was a piece of cake. The hardest part about it was running past all the ladies asking me what my star signs are. We snag the amulet, fuse it to our shaft, and head over to the palace where Jaren tells us that he's got a basement full of demons and sex workers, though one of those groups is much less, alive than the others. Heading down into the basement itself, I don't really have much of a choice but to make a beeline for the entrance to the Arcane Sanctuary since this area is packed with ranged enemies. By now we've got more than just thorns to aid us, we've also got a piece of gear that gives us a 5% chance to activate a low-level Frost Nova upon being struck. The chance is low enough that it certainly can't be depended on, but I'd be lying if I said the freeze effect didn't save my life a few times. We come close to getting killed since I'm just running from room to room trying to get away from ranged enemies only to run into even more ranged enemies. We even have to stop and go resurrect our merc a handful of times before making it into the Arcane Sanctuary. I'm going to spare you the details on this one since it's a lot of "and then I stood there and let them hit me" without anything of real interest happening. Though the mini-boss at the end did come close to killing me with his magic, but our merc came in and shanked him like he was owed a carton of cigarettes. All that's left to do in Act 2 is find the correct tomb of Tal Rasha and face Duriel. The tomb is pretty densely populated with the creatures we've come to expect from these places, and we stay poisoned basically the entire time. Like that feeling you get when you think you've recovered from the Taco Bell you had only to paint your floor with a fresh new shade of bile. Our merc dies several times, mostly due to me just meandering through crowds and leaving the heavy lifting to him. How many times can you kill and resurrect a man before his spirit is just completely broken? I guess we'll have to ask our merc during the pizza party. However, after several trips back to stock up on potions and resurrect our meat shield, we finally come to the entrance of Duriel's lair, and I am honestly very concerned about the fight ahead of us. See, what makes Duriel so dangerous is the fact that he hits so hard, but also can cause you to become frozen, which drastically lowers your movement speed. If you can't get a way to heal, you can pretty quickly find yourself getting stunlocked to hell until it's too late. This fight is also why I wanted to grab a merc, for the extra distraction and damage before it boiled down to a waltz of blood and bone between us. If I could keep the merc alive long enough to give our thorns damage an actual chance at killing Duriel, that's what I needed to do. So during this fight, I switched to keyboard and mouse at least while our merc is still alive. It's easier to heal the merc quickly with the drag and drop of the mouse than it is with the controller, and I needed to buy every second I could. I end up coming stomach-churningly close to dying because Duriel decides to switch targets and come for my neck before I was ready to tag in. Unfortunately, this really threw off what little rhythm I had and the merc goes down. So now I'm panicking because I don't know if I can outpace his damage with my heals, and being frozen reduces my ability to flee. We even get legitimately stunned a few times, so I'm in full-blown panic mode because he is only maybe 2 strikes away from killing the run. By some profound miracle, he punches himself to death right before he would have sent 4 hours of productivity into the Shadow Realm. If you guys had heard the sound I let out when he died, you'd have probably called the police to do a wellness check. We find Tyrael waiting for us, who sends us to rural Pennsylvania, which is pretty much how I remember it being. Act 3 is likely my least favorite in terms of visual identity, at least until we make it to Travancore, but we'll get there soon. Similar to Act 2, our current main objective is to find several pieces of a deconstructed item and duct tape it back together. In this case, we need to find Callum's relics, which include his brain, heart, and an eyeball that we'll need to combine with a flail we'll get our hands on towards the end of the act. The biggest issue for us during this segment of the game is just how many enemies are ranged enemies, specifically the massive population of fetish enemies. There's a knife variant and a blow dart variant, and unfortunately for us, the blow dart variant is much more common. This puts us in a position where we spend more time than before running away from fights. We do also replace the item giving us the chance to proc Frost Nova with a 10% chance to proc a normal Nova. The percentages seem low until you remember just how often we're taking hits, so the effects trigger fairly often. We find Khalim's Eye in the Spider Caverns, which is a cakewalk with the absence of ranged enemies. Poison can still put us in a spooky situation, but for the most part we stomp through this one. Next up we head into the Flayer dungeon to collect Khalim's brain. This was the place in the early portion of Act 3 that I was concerned about. The ranged enemies are annoying to deal with, sure, but there are traps in this dungeon as well as a Flayer shaman whose only TM seems to be flamethrower. Our resistances are not stellar right now, so getting caught up in this attack melts my HP so fast. It even roasts my merc and we have to revive him several times over the course of this dungeon. With so few enemies being melee enemies here, I end up having to stand around and either let the merc handle business or hope my items trigger enough times to quickly kill the enemies attacking me. After struggle busting it through this maze of a place, we claim our second relic and get the hell out. The final relic we require is located in the sewers underneath Kurast, which pushes us into the second half of this act. Once you get out of the jungle, Act 3 gets way more interesting, and what better way to celebrate than to go sewer diving with your best merc? You know, just guys being dudes while hanging out in the equivalent of a Denny's bathroom. The sewers weren't really anything to write home about since most of the creatures here are melee boys. The toughest thing about riding dirty through here is just getting to your destination. Khalim's heart is hidden in the Chuck E. Cheese prize corner, and we scoop it up before heading into Upper Kurast where we can prepare for the final stretch. In order to get down to the Mephisto fight, we have to get the flail and fuse it with Khalim's relics, which will allow us to break an object keeping us out. Before we can do that though, we have to get through a group of terminally online Twitter users who attack us with a myriad of hot takes. Our merc has clearly not been properly prepared for the absolute cesspool that is Twitter, and he dies almost immediately. I think one of the Hydras told him that Korra was better than OG Avatar. We revive him several times, but after I hear one of the Hydras kill him by saying, "It's not creepy that she looks like a child because her character is actually 1,000 years old," I decide to just let my merc rest after that one. I lure some of them away and force them to touch grass, which, as you could have guessed, kills them instantly. I remind the final enemy standing that if you have to boast that you're a nice guy, you're probably a pretty terrible one, and being unable to reconcile that with his own worldview, he exits life and returns to the pre-game lobby. We swipe right on the orb to smash, revive our merc from his dirt nap, and head down into the Durance of Hate where there are many men. Many magic men who wish death upon me. So I made them say it to my face, and we talked it out like gentlemen. It was actually rather refreshing. Down in the boss chamber, the first thing I always do is clear out the extra mobs around the front and sides of the room. The last thing I want is to be retreating from Mephisto to heal only to get ganked by magic men from a distance. Clearing the ads also serves to make sure that our merc stays on task. Something I've kind of brushed over is just how ADHD the mercs are in this game. They'll be attacking one enemy and the slightest shift in positioning will sometimes cause them to change targets entirely. If this happens during the Mephisto fight, it could spell disaster for us. As soon as we initiate combat with Mephisto, our merc dies. It was honestly almost impressive how quickly he ate shit. So we head back to town to revive him because we need a meat shield for this. Thankfully this fight went smoothly once we got back in. What screwed us at first was our proximity to Mephisto. Like many enemies, if you're too far away, he'll break out the ranged attacks, which were melting us. But once round 2 began, we closed the distance as fast as we could, which forced Mephisto into doing melee attacks. Between the merc, how hard Mephisto was hitting us, and just how much was being reflected back, it was game over for the Primeval. Our Thorn skill is at level 20 thanks to a buff from our weapon, so it reflects 1010% of the damage caused as well as a flat amount of 144. And keep in mind, Thorns is an aura, so as long as our merc is nearby, it is also being buffed by Thorns. Mephisto fists himself so hard that his soul pops out and he dies, solidifying that it'll never ever be one of our kinks. We collect the Soul Stone and head to the Pandemonium Fortress where Act 4 takes place. However, I don't actually begin Act 4 right away. Instead, I double back to Act 1 to farm the Countess for rune drops. This was specifically why I wanted to play in offline mode so that I could do this run over and over without having to rediscover the map each time. The goal of this farming run was to bolster our defenses. We're not exactly an effective tank, we've just been supplementing our durability with chugging potions. So, the plan was to collect the runes we needed either through drops or through fusing them into higher tiers so that we could make a shield with the Ancient's Pledge rune word. In the absence of being able to attack ourselves, focusing on our resistances was paramount for the last 2 acts of the game. After 35 minutes of Countess runs, we end up with the runes we need to make a shield with insane elemental resistances. When combined with the miscellaneous items giving us elemental resistances, this shield actually pushes all but one of our resistances to the cap of 75%. The only one lagging is fire resistance, which is only off by 2%. With this shield in hand, it's time to move on down to hell and kill the titular character. Act 4 is definitely the shortest in terms of objectives. I didn't feel like wasting any time here, so I ignored Easewall and headed straight to the Forge to destroy Mephisto's Soulstone, and then headed on over to the Citadel where you fight Diablo. Undoing the seals was about as annoying and dangerous as I expected it to be, with us having to rely on a combination of our mercenary and our random chances to activate a skill when taking damage. The Merc was sort of holding his own in this section, but it was very clear that I might need to take the time to give him some better drip. The Merc died so many times during the unsealing process that I was genuinely getting concerned about falling below the Diablo poverty line. At a certain point, it wouldn't be worth it to revive him, or worse, we wouldn't even be able to afford to. Before the Diablo fight starts, I do what I always do and open a town portal just in case I need to dip on out, and then we get started. As is par for the course at this point, the Merc dies pretty much immediately while I'm trying to get an understanding of all of Diablo's attacks and what's likely to trigger them. I don't even bother reviving the Merc after seeing just how fast Diablo put his lights out and decided it would be more time and cash efficient to just do this alone. Diablo's got several attacks, most of which are ranged magics, so they do us no good. There's only one melee attack, at least from what I saw, so our window for return damage isn't terribly large. We can tank most of Diablo's attacks without fear except one. He can fire a continuous stream of red lightning that chews through my HP so terrifyingly fast that it almost killed me multiple times. At first, I tried to put distance between us to avoid the attack, but that only caused a loop where he'd use more lightning, so I'd keep my distance, so he'd use more lightning. Eventually I realized that I needed to stay close to him, and if the lightning attack came out, I'd need to quickly run around him and still hug his legs. Eventually, without us needing to flee from the fight even a single time, Diablo punches himself so hard that he changes from a fire dark type to a ghost type. With that done, we can head into Act 5, the final stretch of the challenge. I waste zero time running out into the Bloody Foothills to find and kill Shank the Overseer, which will allow the town blacksmith to add sockets to an item for you. I don't end up doing anything with this from what I remember, so let's just move right along. We do the next quest where we rescue 15 imprisoned barbarians, since doing so will cause the Merc NPC in town to give us several runes, and we never turn up our nose at runes. I also ran into one of my most formidable enemies yet, doors. The quest after this is skippable, but at the end of the Ice Prison quest, we're given a scroll that raises our resistances by 10%. Not that we really even need it now, but it's better to have it and not need it than need it and not have it. So we head into the Crystalline Passage to find the frozen river where Anya is being converted into a femsicle. We try our best to avoid the many monsters trying to talk to us about joining their MLM, but if you've ever dealt with anyone that's joined a multi-level marketing scheme, you know this was an impossible goal. I calmly and respectfully tell them that they've all joined a pyramid scheme, and then we move on to free Anya. Once her quest is done, we pursue Neelithak, the guy who trapped Anya in the first place. I'm skipping over basically all of the lore and storytelling because that's not why we're here, now is it? We pursue willy-nilly into his temple, and once we reach him, it becomes a test of patience because Neelithak loves to teleport away from you and attack from afar. In fact, he's far more likely to teleport away than he is to hit you if you close that distance. It became the longest and dumbest game of tag, but I discovered the most consistent way to keep him in place is to pin him to the wall between me and my Merc. If there are any environmental objects, even better. Though saying this method is consistent is being so generous that I might as well slap on a red suit and deliver gifts on Christmas Eve every year. I guess Neelithak doesn't enjoy being DP'd because he does frequently break out of the crowding strat. Not to mention, this strategy only works if my Merc doesn't get distracted by Nilly's minions, and when we did pin him down there was a chance he'd use magic instead of a melee attack. This fight took almost 10 minutes to do, which I know doesn't sound like much, but when you're spending that time chasing an enemy who won't sit still and oftentimes won't even hit you, it makes the fight feel like an eternity. Once that shit show is over, we pass through the Ancient's Way to head up to the Ariat Summit. Before we can pursue Christian Bale, we have to deal with 3 very powerful ancient barbarians who are here to test our worthiness. Something I'd completely forgotten is that you have to do this fight in one go. If you open up a town portal, the ancients will reset and you'll need to start the battle over. I didn't realize this until I think the second or third time I opened a portal. At first it was to revive my Merc, but then I opened the portal to have a way out in case things went wrong, which is when I noticed the reset. This fight is deceptively tough with the current rule set to the point where I think it's one of the toughest battles in the run. It's one thing to be up against one boss enemy with several much weaker minions, and something else entirely to 1v3 a set of equally powerful enemies. Their skill set is also varied, making the fight tougher to handle on the fly if things go south. Thankfully they all have melee attacks, but 2 of the Barbaras in particular did prove troublesome. The more annoying of the 2 has a ranged melee attack that he'll sometimes prioritize over a physical one, but he can also chew through your HP while you're busy letting someone else smack you around. However, the more dangerous of the 2 is the Barbarian with the spin to win Beyblade attack. That attack on its own brought me so terrifyingly close to death several times, and it did so faster than Diablo's Red Lightning. It's easy to get distracted by one Barbara and then suddenly have your HP vanishing because one of them is trying to turn you into a meat smoothie. On my successful attempt, I prioritized taking out Blender Man to remove the insane damage output from the fight early on. From there, it was just a matter of remembering to heal when necessary since the other two are much less of a problem than Blender Man. Once that's been cleared, it's into the Worldstone Keep to find Christian Bale. Now, I'm going to skip all of the busy work of this section since the first 80% of this part is finding your way down to the Bale fight, just like running through any of the other finale sections of the previous acts. The throne room is where things get spicy since we end up being subjected to a wave-based battle where the enemy's Bale summons gradually increase in power but also show up in large numbers. Thankfully the waves are clear-based and not time-based or I'd be screwed. I actually almost die during one of the wave transitions because I forget that the lights Bale shoots out correspond to the spawn points of the summoned monsters, so I end up smack in the center of a demon casting couch, very much in danger. Once we finished our demonic prostate exam, we head down into the Worldstone Chamber to fight Bale and potentially finish the run. But I end up making a massive mistake here and a moment of early onset dementia. See, I knew I was running low on town portals because I'd already used so many having to go back to the hub area to either buy potions, revive the merc, or both. During the wave of demons, I told myself, we're almost out of town portals, go back to town after this fight and buy more. But by the time I finished the waves of enemies, I had already forgotten. In the middle of the Bale fight, I go back to town for a cheeky heal, but completely blanked on getting more portals. So when I return to the battle, I attempt to open a portal and realize I don't have any left. Without meaning to, I had removed my safety net and trapped myself with Bale. I've inadvertently positioned myself so that this is a make or break battle. Either I win or I die and the entire run goes in the trash. I was horrified by the thought, but also incredibly frustrated with myself. This suddenly turned into a DPS race for Bale. All he needed to do was kill my merc and then whittle down my supply of potions. But to my surprise, Bale has a decent number of physical attacks and tends to favor using them when we're crowding his personal space. On top of that, with my resistances being so high, my thorns damage being maxed out, and the additional chance of my items triggering retaliation skills, I realized Bale was the one in serious danger here. I still had a full stock of Fruit Punch Kool-Aid Jammers. My merc was somehow shrugging off most of Bale's attacks, and Bale's health pool was surprisingly shallow. I could mostly sit back and just let him wail on me, but I did still need to be careful that I didn't exhaust my supply of Kool-Aid Jammers and my newfound hubris. After a few minutes, my pacifism paid off and our final enemy finished beating himself to death. I'm genuinely surprised he wasn't putting out enough damage to at least kill my merc, but I'm not complaining. So that wraps up the Diablo 2 run, which was honestly more doable than it had any right to be. Our paladin is still alive, so maybe I'll make a follow-up video where we try to push through nightmare difficulty and just keep going until we actually die. If that's a mini-series you'd be interested in, let me know in the comments. It was a blast revisiting a game I've always loved, putting a fun little spin on it, and forcing myself to play in a way I never have. I may do some more challenge runs in this game, so if you have any ideas, shoot them my way. If you enjoyed this journey as much as I did, please consider leaving a like and subscribing to the channel for more content just like this. I've already got stuff in the works that I think you'll enjoy. If there are any games and challenges you'd like to see me beat my head against, let me know in the comments below. Thank you again to these wonderful people for their continued support over on Patreon. If you'd like to see videos early, see your name in the credit scroll, or snag a portrait, just follow the link in the description below. A huge shout out to Celestial tier backers Super Sunset, This One Snack, and Angus Clydesdale. You guys rock. Remember to take care of yourselves and others, and I'll see you next time.